Hello, community group friends. Today we're going to start with a few slides from our past meeting. That's when we met at the church for our dinner together. And then get into our discussion of the great faith chapter, chapter 11. Let's get started. Last week we discussed the a fortiori argument. I've learned it helps to say this with an Italian accent. Otherwise, I get my tongue all tied. That the author introduces here, in that if the Old Testament calls for no pity for assessing judgment for rejecting the Old Covenant, how much more will a harsh judgment be assessed for rejecting the New Covenant, which, if accepted, guarantees spending eternity with God, the very creator of everything. We had a good discussion last week on the Arminian versus Calvinism positions on Hebrews 10:26 to 31, which really is a challenging section. We discussed the Arminian view, which holds that one can lose one's salvation. And we discussed the Reformed or Calvinist view that says that once we are saved, we are always saved, that we cannot lose our salvation. We concluded last week by noting the author's closing of this chapter with a strong reference to faith, which sets us up, of course, for the greatest exposition on the subject of faith found anywhere in Scripture, chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, which is what we're about to cover. So let's move on to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all about the doctrine of faith and the people who are our examples of faith. Now, one of the things I would like you to think about as we go through this is whether there are many examples whose faith was without flaws. So let's start reading the chapter. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. Without fully realizing it, the ancients, as the author of Hebrews calls them, were looking at the future realities that came with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The people of the Old Testament looked to future things in faith. What are some of the things that we look forward to when Jesus comes again? Well, some of the answers might be to see and worship Jesus and get a glimpse of the Almighty God, to see loved ones, to understand mysteries of the universe, and just to ask questions. Well, regarding that last one, Pastor Allaby and I were once discussing some natural tragedy, and I said that I would like to ask God about this when I get to heaven. Well, his quick, very firm answer was that you won't care. The glory of that place, he said, will be so overwhelming that what we know now will be but a speck of our consciousness, and what replaces it will be so much better. But let's continue. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. What is the purpose of referring to the creation of the universe in this context? Like the Hebrew audience, there are times when the hardships and difficulties of this life tempt us to let go of our faith in God. However, if God can create something out of nothing, he certainly can make something good from the bad. What kind of reasoning is this? We covered this last week. It is, of course, a fortiori. There's that Italian accent again. This concept of making something out of nothing is called creatio ex nihilo.
Example would be to say that is too created, or else that does not, in fact, exist. Everything that is real, that exists other than God, has been created by God. And this is the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, which lies at the very heart of the doctrine of creation. Now, the phrase in Latin, creatio ex nihilo, means literally creation out of nothing. But when theologians affirm that God has created the world out of nothing, they do not mean that he has created it out of something, and that is nothing. That would be to treat nothing as though it were something. Rather, to say that God created the world out of nothing means that he created it, but not out of anything. That is to say, there is.
By the way, this teacher is William Lane Craig, who has written several books, the last one of which, when it went to audiobooks, was narrated by my brother-in-law, John Copeland. Some of you know Lori, my sister. Her husband is John, and he is a voice actor. Well, anyway, enough of family pride. Let's move on. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. Though none of his words have been preserved, Abel has been eloquently preaching for thousands and thousands of years about authentic faith. And what does he say to us? Well, true faith spawns authentic worship. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. It was better because it was obedient to God, giving God what he asked for. This tells us that we dare not bring anything to God until we bring the blood of Christ. The idea of faith in the face of persecution was important to the writer of Hebrews because of the rising storm of persecution that was about to fall on the church. While that persecution likely did not include martyrdom, as the Colosseum here represents, it was nonetheless serious in that there was loss of property and displacement from homes that likely took place. Writing to this church, the author wants to communicate that a deeply intense faith spawns deeply intense hope. That is why in Hebrews 10:38, which we covered last week and noted that it set us up for this chapter, he quoted Habakkuk 2:4, "But my righteous one will live by faith." Indeed, he knew that the key to survival was a solid faith and an attendant hope. And there's a spiritual axiom implicit here. Faith produces hope, and hope produces perseverance. Now continuing to read verses 5 through 7. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Enoch's faith led him to walk with God, and because of this, he was taken to heaven without experiencing death. His life is a model of how faith pleases God, as it shows trust in God's existence and belief that God rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Noah's faith led him to trust God's warning about the coming flood, an event unseen, and in reverent obedience, he built the ark to save his family. His faith not only secured his own salvation, but also served as a condemnation of the unbelieving world. By trusting in God and acting on his word, Noah became an heir of the righteousness that comes through faith. The word for Noah's ark, tebah, is also the word used for the basket that carried Moses when he was a baby. The significance of this type of vessel is that there's no way to steer. This symbolizes full trust in God, absent of our own intervention. Now on to verse 8 and a longer discussion of Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Abraham's faith looked beyond earthly realities to a heavenly city, showing that faith embraces God's promises even without seeing their fulfillment. This deep trust in God earned him the title of God's friend and a place in the heavenly city prepared by God. As a result, from Abraham came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. Sarah is highlighted for her faith as well. Despite her initial doubts about having a child in her old age, Sarah's faith is noted because she believed in God's promise that she would conceive and bear a son. This underscores her trust in God's power, even when it seemed impossible. Sarah's role alongside Abraham is an important part of the overall message of faith in this chapter. Continuing now to the famous account of Abraham and Isaac. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham's faith was demonstrated in his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, believing that God would raise him from the dead to fulfill his promises. This act of obedience shows profound trust in God's word, even when it defied human logic. Additionally, the faith of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph reflects their certainty in God's future promises, blessing their descendants and anticipating God's deliverance, even at the end of their lives. Their legacy is a testament to trusting in God's faithfulness, regardless of circumstances. Romans 12:1 tells us this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. What does this mean? Hopefully, as we follow the thread of faith through this chapter, we'll come to an answer to that question. But for now, just a couple of historical notes that, frankly, I had not focused on, which might be of interest to you as they were to me. The Temple Mount is the location for a number of important events which occurred in the Bible, including the binding of Isaac, which we just read about, Jacob's dream, and the prayer of Isaac and Rebekah. Due to its extreme sanctity, many Jews will not walk on the mount itself to avoid unintentionally entering the area where the Holy of Holies stood, since, according to rabbinical law, there is still some aspect of the divine presence at the site. By the way, I understand that the sign shown to the right is actually the sign that is at the entrance to the temple. So continuing. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Isaac intended to bless Esau, but through Rebekah's intervention, Jacob received the blessing that was meant for Esau. Despite this blessing being gained through deception, it included the promise of abundance, dominion, and being the recipient of God's covenant promises given to Abraham, which made Jacob the key figure in the line of blessing. After Isaac realized what happened, Esau begged his father for a blessing as well. Although Isaac could not take back the blessing given to Jacob, he did give Esau a kind of secondary blessing. This blessing was more of a prophetic statement about Esau's future. He would live away from the riches of the earth and serve his brother, but he would eventually break free from that servitude. In Hebrews 11:20, when it says, "By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future," it refers to both the direct and indirect outcomes of Isaac's blessings. The blessings Isaac pronounced on both of them reflected their future destinies, even though Jacob's was the central covenantal blessing. Now on to Moses. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Moses left Egypt by faith, seeing the invisible God, and led Israel through key events like the Passover and the crossing of the Red Sea. His faith was rooted in looking ahead to God's promised reward. This last point, the Passover, is a powerful symbol of Christ's atoning work, connecting the Old Testament's deliverance with the New Testament's salvation message, starting with Jesus as the Passover lamb, redemption from sin, just as the Hebrews realized a redemption from slavery, and the link between the Lord's Supper and Passover. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. The faith of the people who passed through the Red Sea demonstrated their willingness to follow Moses, trusting that the sea would remain parted. It's a powerful testament to their collective faith. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for several days. Have you ever wondered whether what you are hearing from God is realistic? How about this case of faith? The Israelites marched around Jericho for 7 days, as God has instructed, and on the seventh day the walls miraculously collapsed. This act of faith by Joshua and the people of Israel is a major example of how faith and obedience to God's command can lead to victory, even when the instructions seem unusual or impossible by human standards. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Rahab's faith, though she was a Gentile and a prostitute, exemplified true trust in God. She believed in the God of Israel, obeyed the spies' instructions, and demonstrated her faith by protecting them and hanging the scarlet cord. Despite her past, her faith resulted in her salvation, the deliverance of her family, and ultimately inclusion in the lineage of Christ. Rahab's story shows that faith works through obedience, even in the unlikely circumstances, and that God can use anyone, regardless of their backgrounds, to fulfill his purposes. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. Gideon led Israel to victory over the Midianites with only 300 men, demonstrating his faith by trusting God's unconventional battle plan and overcoming his own doubts and fears. Despite initial hesitation, Barak faithfully followed the prophetess Deborah's call to lead Israel into battle against the oppressive Canaanite army, showing that God can empower the hesitant and uncertain to achieve victory. By the way, one of our missionary sons' name is Barak. Though deeply flawed, Samson displayed faith in God's calling to begin the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. His final act of faith came when, blinded and imprisoned, he called upon God's strength to bring down the Philistine temple, sacrificing himself in the process. A marginalized and outcast figure, Jephthah led Israel to victory over the Ammonites. His faith is highlighted by his dependence on God's guidance in battle, though his tragic vow brings complexity to his story. Known as a man after God's own heart, David's faith was evident in his defeat of Goliath and throughout his kingship, where he trusted God's promises even in the face of adversity and personal failure. The opening section of 1 Samuel has Hannah, Samuel's mother, dedicating her son to God. When Samuel was weaned, Hannah took him to the temple to begin his life of service. One night, Samuel was sleeping, apparently as was his practice, in the Holy of Holies. God called him and spoke to him about his future as a judge and a prophet. As the last judge and a prophet, Samuel faithfully led Israel and appointed its first kings. His life of faithfulness, from his youth serving in the temple to his role as a prophet, exemplified steadfast obedience to God. In addition to the names that are mentioned here, we cannot miss this phrase where those in the Hall of Fame of faith had their weaknesses turned into strength. Let me say that again. Their weaknesses turned into strength. Of course, this reminds us of Paul's statement. Can you say which it is that I'm referring to? Paul describes how he was given this, quote, thorn in the flesh, close quote, to keep him humble after experiencing great revelations from God. Paul prayed 3 times for the thorn to be removed, but God's response was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This is where Paul acknowledges that it is through his own weakness that Christ's power is fully displayed. The context emphasizes the idea that human weakness provides an opportunity for God's strength to be evident, which is why Paul says he will boast in his weaknesses. It's a message of finding divine strength even in personal suffering or limitations. Do we not think this principle is manifested in most of the examples we visited today? We now conclude with the chapter with verses 37 to 40. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. The phrase, "only together with us would they be made perfect," suggests that the salvation and perfection that come through Christ apply to both Old Testament believers and New Testament believers. In other words, the redemption and perfection that Christ achieved were not limited to those who lived after his coming, but extend to all of God's faithful throughout history. Together, both groups share in the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. The whole chapter, but particularly these last few verses, are antithetical to the so-called prosperity gospel. So, what is the prosperity gospel? The first idea is that Jesus purchased all the benefits of salvation for this life. Jesus purchased complete physical healing for his people in this life through his death on the cross. In the Abrahamic covenant, God promised a vast material and financial inheritance for the believers in this life. If a person believes in Jesus, he will inherit great possessions and tangible blessings in this life. The way to gain riches is to give more money to the kingdom, especially by giving to their churches and ministries. The quantity of material and financial prosperity one expects to gain is in proportion to what one gives. Faith and prayer empower people to lay hold of physical and materials in life. In fact, if someone exercises enough faith, he or she will no longer have to be subject to the crippling effects of sickness and disease. If individuals continue to suffer afflictions or poverty, it is due to their lack of personal faith. Prosperity gospel preachers target desires for provision, position, and power. Instead of focusing on Christ, eternity, and the glory of God, they place an emphasis on living one's best life now. Many people in economically depressed communities and in third world countries follow this teaching because it holds out promises of social empowerment and deliverance from extreme poverty and disease. You can see here some of the people associated with prosperity gospel. While I am hardly a proponent of the prosperity gospel, I'd like to close by putting this point in the perspective of the question I asked you to consider at the outset. Do you remember that at the beginning of this discussion, I suggested that you think about these members of the Faith Hall of Fame and ask yourself whether they are perfect examples of faith? Is Abraham, Moses, Gideon, David, Samson? I think you'll agree the answer is no. The underlying message, without being explicit, is that while these figures should be venerated because of their faith, the details of their lives also serve as an assurance that God can work through anyone who is willing to trust him, no matter how imperfect their faith may seem. So, with that thought, one that is both inspiring and comforting, we'll end this lesson. I really look forward to discussing this with you. See you soon.